We continue on here in our study of 1 Kings. And the kingdom of Israel, the 12 tribes, have split with the son of Solomon, who's Rehoboam. And Rehoboam retains kingship over Judah and Benjamin, those two tribes. But then all the northern tribes, the 10 others, go with Jeroboam. We've been looking at Jeroboam in the past few weeks. Their names are the same, by the way. Jeroboam, Rehoboam, just change the one letter in the front. So try not to get confused with that. That can be confusing. But Rehoboam is the king in the south, in Judah. He is the son of David. And so we read of him and his kingship here in 1 Kings chapter 14, beginning in verse 21. This is God's word, eternally true. Rehoboam, son of Solomon, was king in Judah. He was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel in which to put his name. His mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. By the sins they committed, they stirred up his jealous anger more than their fathers had done. They also set up for themselves high places, sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. There were even male shrine prostitutes in the land. The people engaged in all the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. So King Rehoboam made bronze shields to replace them and assigned these to the commanders of the guard on duty at the entrance to the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the Lord's temple, the guards bore the shields, and afterward they returned them to the guard room. As for the other events of Rehoboam's reign and all he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? There was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. And Abijah, his son, succeeded him as king. Here ends our reading. There's a response of thankfulness that's printed for you in your bulletin there. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks indeed. Let's pray. Sometimes there are certain texts that primarily go to certain people, but all texts of the Scripture apply to all of us in some way or another. I find this to be the case when I have to preach at an ordination service, and I'm speaking primarily to new elders or new deacons. Yet there are things about these people that are primarily addressed that go to all of us as believers. This morning you see that our gospel exhortation is entitled Mary in the Faith. Mary in the Faith. And you may have married in the faith, and so don't tune out. Because there are principles here that come from what spills out of marrying in the faith that apply to all of us in a very deep and significant way and serve as warnings and a guide to blessing to us as we live our lives as believers in Jesus. And so, but very starkly and clearly, we just state this. God wants us to know, number one, God says this to us. God prohibits marrying outside the faith. God prohibits us marrying outside the faith. So if you're not married yet, hear this clearly and strongly. This is not something to mess with. We saw from Paul that he said, if you came to faith as a believer and your spouse didn't come to faith, stay married. God institutes marriage, and he puts two people together till death do they part. But he says, if your spouse does die, you're free to marry again, but only in the Lord. but only to someone who belongs to the Lord. And so Paul's dealing with this here. But where do we get that in this passage here? And this is something you do when you look at a text of Scripture. When something gets repeated, especially when it gets repeated at the beginning and then gets punched to you at the end, you say, oh, okay, that's your sandwich. Here's your bread, and then you got the story in between. That's what God is getting at here. We know that even when God's people came back from exile in 538 BC, they didn't get this point. We see in Ezra chapter 9, we see in Nehemiah chapter 13, that they were still marrying unbelievers. Now, God had made that very, very clear in Deuteronomy 7 before the people entered into the promised land. He told them, when you enter into that land, don't give your daughters to their sons, to unbelieving sons in marriage. And don't give your sons to their daughters in marriage. Because verse 4 of chapter 7, Deuteronomy, because they will turn your hearts from the Lord. And so this is a very important thing, but we see even as God's people come back from the exile that they're still doing this. And both Ezra and Nehemiah, who are two people speaking who are back in the promised land after exile in Babylon, they have to speak to God's people because so many of them are married to unbelievers. But we see that in this passage here. Look at verse 21. Verse 21. What's this key fact that we're told about Rehoboam? Not how long his hair was, or what color his hair was, or how tall he was, or various things that were about him. Verse 21, his mother's name was Naamah, and there's not a period there. She was an Ammonite. Ammonites were not Israelites. Ammonites were descendants of Lot and his incestuous relationship with his daughter. Ammon and Moab were the two sons born incestuously to Lot and his two daughters after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. And God's people were to consider these distant relatives, but funny distant relatives. Relatives that had I'll use a big word here, ignominious beginning there, a kind of a scandalous beginning. Lot is not only kind of deaf to the what's going on around him and hesitant to leave Sodom and Gomorrah, even at the prompting of these angels who come to visit him, but also after his wife dies, turns into a pillar of salt, he engages in incestuous relationship with his two daughters, and that's where Moab and Ammon come from. Then at the end of this passage, again, you look at verse 31. Look at verse 31 there. And Rehoboam rested with his fathers, that means he was dead, and was buried with them in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. So this is God prohibiting us from marrying outside the faith. We've got these bookends, 21 and 31. But right after this, you see verse 22. How does the author of 1 Kings deal with this little fact? So get this, verse 21. His mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. By the sins they committed, they stirred up his jealous anger more than their fathers had done. This is dealing with the book of Judges, their fathers, and all the immorality that was going on before Saul and David and Solomon became king. So Deuteronomy 7:3, God had communicated to his people through Moses, do not intermarry with them, do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. Paul picks this up in 1 Corinthians 7:39. A widow is free to marry, but he must belong to the Lord. So A, there in your outline, 1A. This prohibition has always been a distinguishing, just to make some points for us in modern day, it has always been a distinguishing of faith in the true God. It's a distinguishing of faith in the true God and has never been about race, as some has mistakenly presumed. Genesis 1:31. God creates human beings, male and female, and he says, this is very good. All races are the creation of God. All that we see today, then comes from Noah, from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. All human beings bear God's image. And there's no prohibition racially. The prohibition here is a faith thing. So we see this further in the history of Israel. So examples, that's your B. Your blank there is examples. Tamar, who marries Judah. Okay, you said Jesus comes from Judah. Tamar is 3/4 Canaanite. And Judah takes her as his wife, and she is, as Judah says, so it's 3/4 Canaanite, wife of Judah. Those are your blanks there. Judah declares her more righteous than I. If you recall that story there. You're more righteous than I. Next, Zipporah. She's a Midianite. She's not an Israelite, and she's the wife of Moses. Next, we have Rahab. She's a Canaanite. She marries Solomon. That looks like our fish, salmon. Salmon. She marries Solomon, ancestors of Boaz. And then there's Ruth. She's a Moabite. And she is the wife of Boaz. And Ruth and Boaz are the great-grandparents of David. Okay? And if you're familiar with the Rahab story or the story with Ruth, they came to faith. Like Ruth says, your God, she says to her mother-in-law Naomi, your God is my God. Your people, my people. Your land, my land. Ruth converts and becomes an Israelite, even though racially she was a Moabite. Likewise with Rahab. Rahab says to the spies when they come and spy out the land, when Joshua's first coming over, crossing the Jordan River to conquer the land, she says, your God has brought you up out of Egypt. He's the true God. And he brought you out through these 10 plagues. And so she begs these spies to be considered one of the Israelites. And so they spare her life, which they don't do for all the rest of those who live in Jericho. And so you see in the Old Testament, there's always this call to non-Israelites to come and believe. In fact, we see in the first 5 books of the Bible that there are Egyptians that come out of Egypt with Moses and are among them because they have become convinced that the God of the Israelites is the true God. And we've been talking about this as a family. The 10 plagues are making fun of all the Egyptian gods. So there was a frog god. There was a god who controlled light and darkness. And so God brings these 10 plagues on the Egyptians so they will consider their gods a pest. Right? Like the frog was a god. Well, I'll make them a pest for you. They didn't want the image of their God around anymore because God filled their land with frogs. Mallory likes frogs a lot, so she doesn't like frogs. So there were Egyptians who come out with Moses, cross the Red Sea with them, who have become Israelites. So the prohibition about marriage is don't marry someone outside faith in the one true God. Don't marry someone who doesn't believe. So why does God prohibit marrying outside the faith? Because number two, marrying outside the faith leads to, here's your blank, idolatry. Idolatry is the belief, that's your next line there. Idolatry is the belief that other things in life have more worth than God. Other things can satisfy you. Other things will bless you. That's idolatry. And God's people in the promised land, they got into idolatry. We hear about Asherah poles and Baal worship, and we see that here with Rehoboam. That happens with him as it happened with his father Solomon. Solomon too married outside the faith. And we read in chapter 10 that is of 1 Kings that His wives, who were of other faiths, led his heart away from the Lord. And he began to erect Asherah poles and sites of Baal worship, and to allow people to spread out altars on every high hill. Those weren't altars to the Lord. And set out sacred stones. Those weren't sacred stones to the Lord. Those were objects of pagan worship. And so they do all this evil because Rehoboam's heart is led away from the Lord. He goes into idolatry. And so you see that there in verse 23. They also set up for themselves high places, sacred stones, Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. We remember God said, worship me in the place where I will put my name, Jerusalem. But yet the people just worship the Lord and sacrifice to him everywhere. But only on the altar in Jerusalem were people to offer their offerings, their sacrifices. So we as a people are to be people who have our minds on the Lord and not our minds led astray to other things, or thinking other things are worthwhile, or other things are things that we're to put our attention to, or our time to, or to devote ourselves to, when those things contrast or contradict our faith in Christ. Paul put it this way in Colossians 3:1. He said, since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God's throne. Set your hearts on the things above. Our hearts are to be after the things of God. And the problem with idolatry is our hearts are going after other things. We have other things that we're bowing down to, devoting ourselves to, that are interfering with our pure and simple faith in Jesus, as Paul put it in 1 Corinthians 11. So, when someone marries someone who's not a believer, when they're living with that person day after day after day, that non-believer's value system creeps in. What they value, which are not the things of heaven above where Christ is, which are not the things of righteousness and God's law, which is very different than what the world's doing, those things just wear you down and they erode you like water coming, and hitting the sandcastle. And so that's why God doesn't want us to marry unbelievers, because idolatry comes in, just like he said in Deuteronomy 7 from the beginning. Don't intermarry with them, because they will turn your hearts from the Lord. And of course, we see this with Solomon and now with Rehoboam. So there in your outline, Scripture identifies this idea, saying this, that is believing other things have greater worth than the Lord, or will provide greater satisfaction than the Lord will provide. And think about that. Greater satisfaction than the Lord will provide. We always want to be asking ourselves, do I have something in my life that I think will provide greater satisfaction for me than the Lord will? Than walking in faithfulness to the Lord and having the Lord's absolutely silent approval of me. You're not going to hear anything from heaven saying, way to go, John. And I used to hear my dad's voice my mom's shout from the stands. And that was wonderful, but we don't get that from the Lord. That's why you should be encouraging to each other as believers. You're the Lord's voice to each other. That's why it's important for us to gather together. But is God more satisfying than other things? Or do I want to go after these other things where other people will approve me? People of the world will approve me. Or do I just think on its own that I will be more satisfied if I have this thing that God prohibits? Or if I refrain from doing this thing that God commands me to do? But this is worshiping, that's your blank there. This is worshiping and going after other gods in your heart. And that's a common phrase for us. God says, don't go after other gods. Or they've gone after other gods. In Ezekiel, he puts it very specifically in chapter 14. Twice there, he says that his people had idols in their hearts. Their hearts were involved in idol worship. They were going after other gods in that way, just like Rehoboam did here in 23. Another thing, B, when you ignore God's commands to do, in order to do what you want, you have another God. You've just said there's something more important to me than obeying the Lord, than bowing down to the Lord and saying, yes, Lord, your will, not mine, be done. In a micro way, that's every time we sin. But if we get into a pattern of sin or going after something, and it's a habitual thing where we're doing this day after day and week after week, we're devoting ourselves to something that God has said we should not be involved in, we are bowing down to that thing. We are serving that thing. We're worshiping that thing. And you know, I've mentioned it to you before, the word for worship and serve are the same word in the Old Testament. And English translators have to decide all the time, do I translate this to the English word serve, or do I translate this to the English word worship? It's because those are related ideas, and contextually you see that in the Old and New Testament. If you're serving someone, you're worshiping him. If you're serving someone, you're saying, you are so worthy, I will do what you tell me to do. You have such worth, I'll do what you declare I should be doing. I will serve you. If you say I should do it, I will do it. If you say jump, I'll say how high. And that should be reserved only for the Lord. That we serve, that we worship him, that we have no other thing that we are bringing before the Lord, serving before the Lord, obeying before the Lord, bowing down to before the Lord. So when you ignore God's commands to do what you want, you have another God. Rehoboam had other gods. In fact, he spurned God's commands in more than just worship, and we can do that as well. This in terms of marriage. That can happen to us in marriage too. And my wife and I have seen that, and friends from high school who were believers and said, oh, but he's really nice or she's really nice, and they've given up and they marry someone who's not a believer. Well, I think all those people are divorced now. Can I tell Ann's story a little bit, Joyce? So Ann's 31 and she just got married. And literally like a year ago, she went to this Christian retreat center where she was married, right? Yeah, close to it. And she said, God, what are you doing? I want to be married. But she was committed not to marry just anybody. And she was committed, if it need be, I will be single. Even though the desire of my heart is to be married. But here I am, 31 years old. And God brings along Kevin. And Kevin, unbeknownst to him, proposes to Ann in that same place where she made that prayer. Who's Ann's God, right? God is God. She didn't bow down to some other guy. She didn't bow down to needing to be married. She didn't say that satisfaction comes from marriage, and so I'm going to carve it out on my own in spurning God's command. You think Ann's going to be blessed in her marriage? I think so. You think God's going to honor that? I think so. My favorite movie is Chariots of Fire. And if you know that movie, Jackson Schultz, the American, he's an American sprinter, and he goes up to Eric Liddell, the believer, who's running the 400 meters. And he goes up to him and he hands him a note. And the note is 1 Samuel 2:13 or 14. And it's where the Lord says, those who honor me, I will honor, says the Lord. And that's who we are as Christians. Those who honor me, I will honor, says the Lord. And so we don't say, something else is going to bring me satisfaction, and so I'll not follow the Lord here. We honor the Lord in what we're doing, in all we're doing. So, third thing, C. You must remember that other things, whether it's being married or the approval of a boss or keeping a job or keeping your friends, other things are not sovereign. There's that word again, sovereign. R-E-I-G-N. My wife is a fast speller. Her head just darted when I got the wrong. Other things are not sovereign and cannot orchestrate blessing for you. If you treat something like an idol, like something that's going to bring you satisfaction, it becomes an idol and it cannot hear your request and it cannot act. And just as God sarcastically and dramatically says of his people in the Old Testament, those idols you've built, they're built out of stuff I made. And in fact, you assembled them together out of your own hands. And they have ears that cannot hear, and eyes that cannot see, and they cannot move, and they cannot act. They can do nothing to bring blessing to you. And so if we treat something as an idol, as something more important than God, as something we think will bring us satisfaction that's greater than a satisfaction than God can bring to us, we have to remember that thing we're treating as a God is no God at all. It's something that's in our heads that's not true, that more satisfaction will come from something or someone else that's not God. And that thing that we're treating as an idol or a God can't sovereignly orchestrate circumstances to bring us blessing, but the living God we love and serve can. Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Is there any out? Bow down when you hear the trumpet and the harp and the lyre and all these things. Bow down. And they don't do it. And if you don't bow down, you'll be cast into this fiery furnace. And the king even gives them a second chance because they're good counselors to him. He says, okay, we're going to do it again. It's a do-over. And he says, so when you hear the trumpet and the harp and the lyre, you bow down. And they say, we will not bow down, O king. And our God is able to save us. But even if he doesn't, know this, O king. You are not God. This statue is not God. The Lord we serve is God. And he's able to rescue us even from death. And so that needs to be our mindset. God is the giver of blessing. And guess what? God honored those who honored him. And they go into that furnace. The people who toss them into the furnace die from the heat. It's so hot, just getting near the door. But they survive in that furnace, and they come out. They don't even smell smoky, all right? Not even their clothes. So remember, God, those things are not sovereign. They cannot orchestrate blessing for you. Or in this case, where we're talking about marriage, an unbelieving spouse will not result in blessing for you, just like it didn't for Rehoboam, just like it didn't for Rehoboam's people. Okay, it's going to be a mess for your kids if you get married to an unbeliever. Now three. Remember that Jesus, as your God, is a perfect husband. Remember that Jesus, as your God, is a perfect husband. Isaiah 54:5 says this, for your Maker is your husband. Aha, you thought that was only in Ephesians 5 in the New Testament. God presents himself as that in the Old Testament. The husband of God's people who were his bride. That's why God is jealous. Do you get that? You're jealous when you're the God of your people and also the husband to your people, and your people who are your bride go after other gods. They're going after other husbands. That's why God is jealous in the Old Testament. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all the earth. Jeremiah 3:14. Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you. One from a town and two from a clan. I will bring you to Zion. This is Jeremiah speaking to those who've been exiled. And then, of course, in Ephesians 5, and you had that in your declaration of the gospel this morning. You can look at that on the front of your bulletin if you want to. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Ephesians 5:2, the start of that. Jesus gave himself for the church. Jesus being husband of the church, his bride, being your husband, that is the model for husbands on earth. What we're to be, we're to give ourselves for our spouses, but we're to remember that Jesus, as our God, is a perfect husband. So A, there in your outline, Jesus in the gospel, recognize this, he paid the dowry price. So in old cultures and some cultures today, that there needed to be a dowry price, something paid to get a spouse. And Jesus pays that price. Jesus pays his price, and that dowry price is his own blood. He paid that dowry price for you, or you can write in your blank there, for me. He paid that dowry price for you. He bled for you. That was the price. That was the payment he paid for you. You know, redemption, we think of Jesus being the Redeemer or redemption, and that's a religious word. It's an economic term that the Bible borrows, and it means to buy back. To buy back something that used to be yours that you lost. And God created Adam and Eve, he created humankind, and then he lost them through their disobedience. But God bought a people back for himself. And the price, the redemption price, what he had to pay was not $1,000, not 1,000 chocolate chip cookies. But what he paid was the blood of his son. Jesus paid that price for you. You were worth it to him. He had his eye on you. He chose you, as he said through Jeremiah there. So he paid the dowry price, his own blood for you, to have you as his bride. To have you as his bride. Revelation 5:9 talks about this purchase. This is when Jesus, after his death, after his resurrection, after his 40 days on earth, after his resurrection, when he's instructing his disciples about the kingdom of God, he ascends to heaven. In Acts chapter 1, verse 9, his disciples see him rise up into heaven, into the clouds, and then we see the back end of that in Revelation 5. And that's the scene in heaven when Jesus is not there. And there's fretting in heaven. Who will take the scroll, the list of names, the book of life, and tear open its seals so that our names can be read? And we can be found in the end at final judgment to be legitimately here because our names are written on the book of life, but it's sealed up now and no one is worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals. Who will do that? And then at the beginning there at Revelation 5, we see Jesus, a lamb looking as if he had been slain. And he comes and heaven declares, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals. And then here's what it says in verse 9. You were slain, and with your blood you purchased men for God. You know, in the dowry price, there was essentially a purchase for a spouse. Now, that wasn't a mail order bride, but it was a gift given. But Jesus purchased. You were slain, and with your blood you purchased men for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. So realize this. Jesus is the husband who paid a dowry price to get you. And so B, he gave himself for you not to be a distant God. He gave himself for you not to be a distant God, but to be your spiritual husband. To be your spiritual husband, to love you, to protect you, to provide for you, and to satisfy you fully. To satisfy you fully. You know, in junior high and high school, I loved romantic movies. It's funny, I tend toward romantic movies. My wife likes action flicks. So I love Love Story, 1970, Ryan O'Neal and Ally McGraw. In my mind, it was a little bit of why we named Allison with one L. Ally McGraw, Somewhere in Time with Christopher Reeve and Jane Seymour, great love story there. Even King Kong with Jeff Bridges and Jessica Lange. I love the love story aspect of that. That was out in late 1976. That's where I saw my first preview to the original Star Wars, by the way. I was there watching King Kong, and they showed previews coming this summer in a galaxy near you. We saw Darth Vader and heard that breathing, and we said, "What in the world? That's awesome. I gotta see that." But I love these romantic movies because I love the idea that if I could just find the perfect wife, I found that, right? If I could just find the perfect wife, I would be utterly satisfied. Everything would be perfect. And, love would mean never having to say you're sorry. That's a line from Love Story. That's not true, by the way. But, I'd love her. She'd be perfect. She'd do everything I needed to be done. And it would just be delightful all the time. Fairy dust view of love, right? It sprinkles upon you and it never leaves, that kind of thing. But I saw, that would be my key to total satisfaction. I kind of figured everything out. I could go to school and take these classes and study real hard and do this well in school. And, I charted out my career path and that kind of thing. It wasn't ministry at that time. But the only missing piece was finding that perfect bride. And then I would have total satisfaction, like King Farquaad. She's perfect. Right? In our membership interviews, and this will be, very apparent if you think for more than 2 seconds, one of the people that we were interviewing said, "My husband can't bring that satisfaction. My kids can't bring that satisfaction. That satisfaction can only come from Christ." And that's absolutely true. Your spouse, here's a little marriage counseling for everybody who's married, and for those of you who aren't married, don't look for this. Don't expect this. Your spouse cannot be the source of your satisfaction as a human being. And that's good news, because your spouse is a sinner and will be a sinner. Even a believing, devoted to Jesus, pure in faith, let's go to Nepal and share the gospel for the rest of our lives. Even if it's that kind of devoted to Jesus person, that's still a sinner. And you'll be disappointed. And there'll be times when your spouse will do something selfish, or will disappoint you in some way, or you really want to do something and he doesn't want to do it. She doesn't want to watch that romantic movie with you. She wants to watch Arnold or something instead. But human beings weren't created to bear the weight of giving you total satisfaction, of fulfilling you, satisfying you fully. Your spouse, whether present or someone in the future, if you're not married yet, cannot bear that weight. And we're not framed by God to bear that weight of satisfaction for you. But Jesus bears that weight. He can, and he does. I remember one of my Old Testament professors, Mike Glotto, talking about everywhere in the Old Testament where we see a figure or an example, a foreshadowing of Jesus, that figure's always going to fail. David's a foreshadowing of Jesus. Solomon's a foreshadowing of Jesus. Moses is a foreshadowing of Jesus. But they all fail, and they all have sin, and they all let God's people down. But that's built in so that we look for something greater. A greater than David, son of David. A greater than Solomon, son of David, in Jesus, who will not let us down. And that's the case in your marriages too. That you look to your spouse and say, there's brokenness, there's sin there, but that's okay, because my satisfaction comes from my true husband, the one who bled and died for me, the one who picked me out and wanted me, and didn't say, like in Tina Fey at one point in 30 Rock says, she decides she's just going to settle on some guy who says, "Oh, okay, you're good." But Jesus doesn't just settle on you. He fixes his eyes upon you to have you as his bride. But Jesus can bear that weight of being your satisfaction. And that means you don't have to be so disappointed or so distraught when your spouse doesn't satisfy you or bring you that joy that I had hoped as a junior high school kid, and banked all that on when I was that age. And so number one, all that to say this: total satisfaction, in part now. Okay, now you got things that go wrong still, right? Your body's breaking down and all that kind of thing. But in part now and in whole later, total satisfaction is not through human husbands, or if you put them in the role of God, the one who totally satisfies you. And so whether you're married now, that total satisfaction will not come from the one you're married to. And if you're not married, you don't have to think, oh man, I'm going to have if I just marry this person, I'll just be satisfied. I'll be satisfied. It won't come through human husbands, no matter how, even if that human husband is a devoted believer, or that potential wife is a devoted believer, but through Christ. That's your blank. But through Christ and your faithfulness to him as your husband. So don't think, if you're not married, about an unbeliever. Oh, I have to have this person as my spouse. My satisfaction and happiness in life depends on it. I don't see any other prospects coming. Another year, and I'm still not dating anyone. Another year, and I'm still not married. And don't settle. Don't settle, because your satisfaction comes from Jesus. Whether you're married or whether you're not married. If you read that whole passage that Paul writes about marriage, he'd been asked about marriage, and he responds in 1 Corinthians 7. He's saying, I'm not married, and I kind of like it. I can devote all my attention to the Lord. And other people I know who aren't married, they're devoting all their attention to the Lord. They don't have to go home and take care of their kids. They don't, get a call from their wife saying, hey, can you come home now? I need you to help with this or that kind of thing. They can just do whatever they want at any time. And Paul said, I kind of prefer that. So if you're not married, don't get married. It's okay. But he said, I know that's not the case for most people. So rather than put yourself in peril and that kind of thing, if there's someone to marry. But that person needs to be in the Lord. But your satisfaction, your happiness will not depend on that. Marriage or no, Paul wasn't saying you need to get married or you won't be satisfied. But listen to how God speaks of himself with satisfaction in us. Psalm 103:5. God satisfies your desires with good things so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. Psalm 107:9. For God satisfies the thirsty, and he fills the hungry with good things. Psalm 147:14. God grants peace to your borders and satisfies you with the finest of wheat. God very clearly and unapologetically presents himself as the satisfier of our souls and of our lives. And we always need to remember that, whether it's just us facing persecution for perhaps obeying the Lord in a particular way. I have to remember, but God will satisfy me. Avoiding persecution, that won't be satisfying. I'll feel guilty. I'll feel empty. But if I obey the Lord and I get persecuted for it, I'll be satisfied in my soul. Or if you're tempted to marry someone who's not a believer, same thing. It would be better, Paul said, I'll survive. It would be better to be faithful to the Lord, to my husband, faithful to him, and not to go after another god, this idea that marriage will bring me satisfaction in total in my soul. But number two, in contrast, have Jesus, whether married or unmarried, be your true source of satisfaction. Did you see how Paul talked about Jesus in Philippians chapter 3? He recounted all these things that ordinarily you'd think would bring someone satisfaction. I was a 3-time All-American and got drafted first in the draft and had been All-Pro 10 years in a row. He says the equivalent of that. except for being a Jewish person. I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees. As for the law, zealous. But then he speaks, Philippians 3:7, but whatever was to my profit in my former way of thinking, whatever was to my profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. If I have to give up anything to know Christ, I will. Because he's that worth it. He's worthy of my worship. He's worthy of my life. He's worthy of suffering. He's worthy of being despised by those who formerly respected me among the Jews. For whatever was to my profit, Paul says, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord, for whose sake I've lost all things. Do you see the joy in the midst of the pain of life? Life is pain. If you don't know that, you're young. But even young kids know it. That's why babies are crying. So the kid in the doctor's office on Wednesday was saying, I want a toy, to his mom there. And he was kind of whimpering and crying. Life is pain, but there's joy in the midst of pain in this life that Paul expresses here. And if I have Christ, I'm good, Paul says. It doesn't matter. It's like Job, strip everything from me and I'm good as long as I have my God. That's where satisfaction is. Job doesn't say, well, if that's the way God treats me, that's not satisfying. I'll just go do whatever I want. No, Job continues in faithfulness, knowing that all else are idols and can't provide anything better for him than his God could. It's like Peter, Jesus, in John 6, after the bread of life discourse, right? Jesus does the miracle of bread there, and then he gives the gospel, and he says, I am the bread of life. He who eats of me will never be hungry. And people say, that's kind of gross. You a cannibal? What? And the crowd actually starts to leave. And Jesus turns to his disciples there in John 6, around verse 63, and he says, and what about you? Will you leave me as well? And Peter has that, you love Peter, right? He says what he's thinking. And sometimes he gets it really right. And here he gets it right. And he says, no, Lord, where else shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. Whatever happens to us in life, whatever a lot in life ends up being, or whatever it looks like it might be, we're okay. Because we know the one who has eternal life. And if everybody leaves us, if everybody abandons us, we're okay. As long as we have our good husband who satisfies our souls with good things. Not false things, not false promises that promise to give us satisfaction that make us to feel empty. We're going to sing here in a minute. Well, no, more than a minute. We're doing the Lord's Supper. We're going to sing after the Lord's Supper. What's that song? What's it called? The sands of time are sinking. And the reason we're singing it is this. Listen to this. Listen to this verse. The bride eyes not her garment. We're the bride. We're in our garments and we're standing before Jesus at our wedding to him at his second coming. That's the scene in this verse. So we've been raised. We're before Jesus. We've been given our white robe that Revelation speaks of. So the bride, us, we eye not our garment and say, this is great. I'm so glad I believed in Jesus because now I've got this great garment on, this great wedding dress, or guys, that I look like a penguin, or whatever your wedding garment is there. The bride eyes not her garment, but her dear bridegroom's face. I will not gaze at glory, but on my King of grace. Folks, Jesus is the prize. Not what we get from him, not what he might provide for us on this earth. Not at the crown he gifteth, but on his pierced hand. The Lamb is all the glory, in Emmanuel's land. This needs to be our mindset as Christians. He is all the glory. There is no greater calling to be faithful and obedient to him, to have him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Way to go. You endured. I know it was hard. And you endured because you loved me." Wouldn't that be great to have him say that to you? So, summary. God, out of his love, he warns you. He warns us in this passage when heed God's warning. So here's your summary. God prohibits marrying outside the faith. And he also, in parallel, he heading into much sin. You know, you can do that without a spouse to lead you in that. All right? You can do that without a spouse leading you into that. But God warns us because he loves us. And so that's your next line there. This is because he loves you and is seeking to rescue you from the misery and hardship that come from that. Okay, so this is Adam and Eve in the garden. Is God withholding pleasure and goodness and satisfaction from Adam and Eve by their not eating of that fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Or is he protecting them from death and misery? And we learn he's protecting them from death and misery, but they don't trust him. They think God is withholding something from me, and that's Satan's temptation. Oh, he's only withholding this from you because he knows this will give you knowledge of what is good and evil. It'll make you like a God. And they believe that false promise and go into death and misery. But if they had just trusted him and walked in his ways, he was telling them not to eat of that fruit to save them from misery. It's the same with us. And so last line there, neither a human spouse nor actions of unfaithfulness are your true source of satisfaction in life. A human spouse, actions of unfaithfulness, doing something God's prohibited, they're not your true source of satisfaction. They won't provide satisfaction for you in life. But Jesus is. Jesus is the source of satisfaction that we look to, and he provides it for us. Let's pray.